She called 911 on a black man for acting suspicious in his own driveway. What he uncovered about her left the entire neighborhood speechless. It started as a normal afternoon for Karen Whitmore. She sat by her front window, the same way she did every day, sipping her iced tea and glancing up from her phone every few minutes. Watching, noticing. She wasn't nosy, per se. At least, that's what she told herself. She just liked to be aware of what was happening in her neighborhood, who was coming and going, who belonged and who didn't. That's when she saw him. A black man in a grey SUV, slowly pulling into the driveway of the house 3 doors down. The Johnson place. At least, that's what it used to be. The Johnsons had moved out nearly 6 months ago, and as far as Karen knew, no one had bought the property yet. She leaned forward, pressing her lips together as she watched him step out of the car. He wasn't dressed like a delivery guy. No uniform, no clipboard. Just jeans, a navy sweater, and a calm, deliberate way of moving that made it seem like he had every right to be there. But Karen wasn't so sure. She squinted as he walked around to the trunk, pulled out a couple of boxes, and carried them toward the front door. Her fingers hovered over her phone. Should she call someone? Maybe he was with the realtor. Or maybe he was a contractor working inside. But she hadn't seen a for sale sign out front in weeks. Then she noticed something else. The man wasn't just dropping the boxes off. He pulled out a key. A key. And when he slipped it into the lock, he stepped inside. Karen's pulse quickened. Her thumb hovered over her screen, tapping open her recent calls. It wasn't about race, she told herself. This was about safety. What if this man was squatting? What if he was trying to break in? The neighborhood had always been peaceful, and she wasn't about to let things spiral out of control. She hit 911. 911, what's your emergency? Karen exhaled sharply, keeping her eyes on the house. Yes. I'd like to report a suspicious person. A man just entered a vacant home on my street, and I don't think he's supposed to be there. The dispatcher's voice was calm. Can you describe the individual? Karen hesitated for half a second. Black male, medium build. He parked a grey SUV in the driveway and used a key to go inside. There was a slight pause. So, he used a key? Yes, Karen said quickly. But the house has been empty for months. I don't know if he's supposed to have it. The dispatcher asked for her name, her location, and a few more details before responding. We'll send an officer to check it out. Karen thanked them and hung up. She sat back, crossing her arms, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and nerves. She wasn't accusing the man of anything. She was just making sure everything was in order. That's what a good neighbor did. A few minutes later, she heard the distant wail of sirens. A police cruiser rolled up to the house, stopping just behind the SUV. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts. Karen watched as the man emerged from the house, a look of confusion crossing his face as the officers approached. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw the way his brows furrowed, the way his hands slowly lifted, palms up, like he was trying to explain something. The officers gestured toward his car, then toward the house. Karen leaned in closer, heart pounding. Then she saw something that made her stomach drop. The man reached into his back pocket and pulled out a set of papers, holding them up for the officers to see. One of them took the documents, glanced at them, and nodded. It didn't take long for the tension in their posture to shift. Within a minute, the officers had relaxed. The man gestured toward the door, and one officer even gave him a small nod before stepping back toward the cruiser. Karen's mouth went dry. Something was wrong. They weren't arresting him. They weren't even questioning him anymore. Instead, they were walking back to their car like it was nothing, like she had made a mistake. But Karen had no idea that this was only the beginning. Karen's grip on her iced tea tightened as she watched the officers turn away from the man like everything was settled. Settled. How? She stood abruptly, pushing open her front door, stepping onto her porch, pretending to check her mailbox. Just close enough to hear, but not enough to seem too obvious. The man, who she had assumed was trespassing, was standing with his arms crossed, shaking his head as he looked toward the patrol car. One of the officers gave him a light pat on the shoulder before heading back to the driver's side. Karen couldn't take it anymore. She marched across her lawn, waving her hand. "Excuse me." One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a slightly greying buzz cut, turned back. "Ma'am?" Karen forced a polite smile. "What's going on?" "I'm the one who called. I saw this man enter the house and I was concerned. The property's been vacant for months." The officer sighed, glancing at the man before looking back at her. "Ma'am, this is Mr. Ellington. He's the new owner of the house. He moved in today." Karen blinked. She felt her skin prickle. "What?" The man standing a few feet away exhaled sharply. "Yeah, I live here." His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. Controlled frustration. Karen's mouth opened, then shut. She looked between him and the officers, searching for something that made sense. "But—" She gestured toward the house. "There was no moving truck. No one in the neighborhood knew." Marcus let out a dry laugh. "Didn't realize I needed to run my plans by the neighborhood committee." The officer beside him shifted. Mr. Ellington provided his paperwork, title, mortgage, driver's license. Everything checks out. There was no break-in, no suspicious activity. He narrowed his eyes slightly. "Just a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. Karen's face burned. She turned to Marcus, folding her arms. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. You have to understand. When I saw you pull in—" "You assumed I didn't belong," Marcus finished for her. Karen's jaw tightened. "That's not what I said." "You didn't have to," Marcus shot back. There was a thick silence. Karen could feel the officer watching them both, shifting slightly, maybe waiting for her to just walk away, to let it go. But she couldn't. She turned back to the officer. "I didn't do anything wrong here." The officer exhaled through his nose. "Like I said, it was a misunderstanding. But going forward, if you ever have concerns, I'd suggest speaking to your neighbors before calling us." That felt like a warning. Karen took a step back, lips pressed together. She glanced at Marcus again, expecting to see some kind of smugness in his expression, but there was none, just a look she couldn't quite place. The officers nodded at Marcus before heading back to their cruiser. The moment their doors shut, the tension in the air felt even heavier. Karen turned, ready to walk back to her house without another word. But then Marcus spoke. "Funny," he said, voice quieter now. "You saw me enter my own home. But you never noticed I saw you first." Karen froze. Slowly she turned back. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You've been watching me, haven't you?" Her throat went dry. What?" Marcus didn't look angry. Not exactly. He looked aware, like he'd figured something out. "I noticed you before today. Watching. Walking past. Slowing down when you saw the lights were on." Karen's heart thudded against her ribs. This wasn't how this was supposed to go, and she had no idea just how much Marcus had already figured out. Karen barely slept that night. Her mind kept replaying the way Marcus had looked at her, the way his voice had dropped just enough to unsettle her, like he knew something she didn't. She tried to tell herself it didn't matter. The police had come, they checked everything, and that was that. Nothing more to worry about. But why couldn't she shake the feeling that she had? The next morning, she stood at her kitchen window with her coffee, peeking through the blinds toward Marcus's house. She expected to see him leaving for work, but instead he was in his driveway, leaning against his SUV, and he was looking right at her. Karen jerked back so fast she nearly spilled her coffee. Had he been waiting for her to check? Her chest tightened. Maybe he just wants to make me uncomfortable. Fine. If he thought he could intimidate her, he was wrong. But then the worst thing possible happened. Marcus walked up her driveway. Karen's heart pounded. She had no time to think before the doorbell rang. She hesitated, but then forced herself to move, opening the door just enough to face him. "Yes?" Marcus had his phone in his hand, resting against his hip. "Morning," he said casually. "Thought I'd return the favor. You seem real interested in watching me. Figured I'd stop by and say hi." Karen kept her face neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." Marcus smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "See, I've got cameras. Not just the doorbell kind, full security system. Installed them before I even moved in." Karen's stomach twisted. Marcus lifted his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and then turned it around for her to see. The footage played. Karen saw herself, walking past his house multiple times, slowing down, staring at his driveway. Coming back in the evenings, peering toward the windows, she felt a chill creep up her spine. Marcus tilted his head. "You called the cops on me, but I've got days of footage of you lurking around my house before I even moved in." Karen's throat tightened. She felt a wave of heat rise to her face. I was just taking my usual walk." Marcus let out a short breath, shaking his head. "Right. Because most people take their usual walk past the same house, at the same time, every single day." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Marcus studied her, then pocketed his phone. "See, I wasn't sure what your deal was at first, but then I looked back through my footage. I saw the way you kept looking at the house, like you were waiting for something." Karen's heart pounded. "That's ridiculous." Marcus took a slow step closer. "Maybe. But see, I did a little digging. Found out this house sat empty for months. Yet somehow, people around here knew it was already spoken for." Karen's lips parted, but Marcus continued. "Funny thing is, I was the only one who put in an offer. No one else. No counter bids. Just me." His eyes locked onto hers. "And yet my realtor told me later that there was some neighborhood chatter, that some people expected someone else to move in." Karen felt her breath hitch. Marcus nodded slightly. "What I want to know is, who exactly were you all waiting for?" The silence between them stretched. Karen could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. She wanted to deny everything, to say it was all in his head, but somehow she knew he wasn't guessing anymore. And if he had figured all this out already, what else did he know? Karen shut the door the moment Marcus turned to leave. Her hands were shaking. She stormed into the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, forcing deep breaths in and out. This isn't happening. He had nothing on her. He was just trying to scare her, but deep down, she knew better. Marcus had proof. Proof that she had been watching his house for days. Proof that she had called the cops on him for no reason. And worse, he had figured out what no one was ever supposed to say out loud. That house wasn't meant for him. She had heard the whispers. The woman on the HOA board, Judy, had been casually mentioning at their last meeting that she was keeping an eye on who was buying up homes in the neighborhood. Not in an aggressive way, of course, just a concerned, community-oriented way. And yet, when the Johnson house went up for sale, there had been an unspoken assumption that the next owners would fit the neighborhood's aesthetic. Then Marcus bought it. And just like that, everything shifted. Karen grabbed her phone, opening her neighborhood group chat. She hesitated. If she messaged now, tried to warn Judy or anyone, it would look too obvious, but she had to do something. Because Marcus wasn't letting this go. By the afternoon, the news had already spread. Karen heard it from her neighbor Linda first. A quiet, hesitant knock on the door. Karen pulled it open to find Linda clutching her phone like it had personally betrayed her. "Did you see this?" she asked, her voice a hushed whisper. Karen frowned. "See what?" Linda hesitated, then turned her phone around. Karen felt her stomach drop. It was a video. Marcus had posted the security footage. The clip showed Karen walking past his house over multiple days, peeking, slowing down. The timestamps in the corner made it undeniable. And then the worst part, Marcus himself, speaking at the end. "This is what I saw before I even moved in," he said in the video, his tone level but sharp. "And then, the moment I step onto my own property, cops show up. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't breaking in. I was just a black man moving into his own home." The video cut out. Karen's hands clenched at her sides. Where did he post this?" "Facebook, Instagram, and the neighborhood group," Linda said, her voice nearly cracking. "Karen, what is this?" Karen exhaled sharply. "It's taken out of context." Linda gave her a look. Karen's chest tightened. "I was looking out for the neighborhood. If I saw someone suspicious, I had a right to call the police." Linda's lips pressed together. "But he wasn't suspicious. He was just moving in. Karen swallowed hard. So now I'm the bad guy? Linda didn't answer right away. She looked down at her phone again, then back at Karen. People are talking. Karen stiffened. Judy already commented, Linda added hesitantly. She's trying to do damage control, but... She shook her head. This isn't going away. Karen's face burned. Because Marcus had done exactly what she was afraid of. He had exposed everything, not just what she did, but why she did it. And now, everyone knew. But the real fallout was only just beginning. Karen barely left her house for the next 2 days. She had never felt this kind of humiliation before, not when her youngest son dropped out of college, not when her husband left her for a woman 20 years younger, not when the HOA fined her for leaving her Christmas decorations up until February. This was different, because this wasn't just about her. It was about how people saw her, and the way they were looking at her now was different. The first sign was at the grocery store. She went early, hoping to avoid most of the neighborhood crowd. But even in the quiet aisles, she felt the eyes on her. The stolen glances, the quick whispers. She turned a corner and nearly ran into a woman she knew. Bethany Moore, from 3 streets over. Bethany's face tensed, but she forced a polite smile. "Oh. Hey, Karen. Hey," Karen said, gripping the handle of her cart. She waited for Bethany to say something else, to start a conversation like she normally would. But after a brief, uncomfortable pause, Bethany nodded and walked away. Karen's jaw tightened. The next sign came in the neighborhood group chat. She had been removed. Not officially, of course, but the silence was loud. No one replied to her messages. No one liked her posts. Conversations continued as if she wasn't even there. And then, the HOA meeting. Karen almost didn't go, but skipping it would look like guilt. So she sat in her usual seat, back straight, hands folded in her lap as Judy stood at the podium, rattling off neighborhood updates. Then came the open floor discussion. Marcus stood up. Karen felt her stomach drop. "Since I'm new here," Marcus began, his voice calm, "I just want to make sure I understand how things work." Judy smiled tightly. "Of course. We're all about keeping communication open." "Good to know," Marcus said. "Because I was curious. How does the HOA handle situations where a homeowner is harassed by their neighbors before they even move in?" Silence. Karen's nails dug into her palm. Judy's smile twitched. I'm not sure what you mean." Marcus nodded, pulling out his phone. "I think you do." He tapped the screen, and the same video he had posted online played for everyone to see. Karen's heart pounded. The whispers started. Someone coughed. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus put his phone away. "So, what's the policy on that?" Judy cleared her throat, glancing at Karen. I think we should take this discussion offline." Marcus smiled. "Oh, I'm good having it here. Unless, of course, it's an uncomfortable topic." More whispers. A few murmured agreements. Karen's face burned, because she realized something then. Marcus hadn't come here just to expose her. He had come here to make sure they all saw themselves too, because she wasn't the only one who had wanted him out. But now, no one wanted to be the one standing next to her. She could feel it, the slow, quiet way people were stepping back, distancing themselves. And for the first time in her life, Karen was the one who didn't belong. But the worst was still to come. Karen had always believed that people like her didn't get punished. Maybe some gossip, a few awkward encounters, but nothing serious, nothing lasting. She had spent years building her place in this community, organizing fundraisers, attending every HOA meeting, keeping her lawn perfectly manicured. She belonged here, or at least she used to. The real consequences didn't hit until a week later. It started when her son, Andrew, called. "Mom," he said, his voice tight. "What the hell did you do?" Karen sat up straight in her living room. "What are you talking about?" Andrew sighed sharply. "I got a call from a colleague today. A colleague. You know, someone I work with. He saw your video." Karen's stomach twisted. "That was taken out of context." "Context?" Andrew let out a humorless laugh. "Mom, you called the cops on a guy for moving into his own house, and now it's everywhere. People are talking about it at my office. My boss saw it. Karen's chest tightened. I didn't mean... You didn't mean for it to blow up, Andrew cut in. But you meant every part of what you did. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but Andrew wasn't done. You know what's funny? I never saw you as that kind of person. Controlling? Sure. Stubborn? Absolutely. But now I have to sit in a break room and listen to people talk about my mother like she's some racist caricature. So thanks for that. Andrew, just don't call me for a while, okay? The line went dead. Karen stared at the phone in her hand, an empty, sinking feeling in her chest. For the first time, she felt something close to shame. By the time the HOA meeting minutes were released, her name was gone. No mention of her, no invitations to upcoming events. It wasn't an official removal, but it didn't need to be. She was being phased out. Neighbors who once waved now looked past her. Conversations she used to be part of now happened without her. And then, the final hit, her property value. Karen had spent years building this neighborhood's reputation, making sure homes were only sold to people who fit. Now, Marcus had started a community outreach initiative. Local media picked up his story, framing him as a symbol of resilience against exclusionary practices. People outside the neighborhood began watching, asking questions about how the HOA had handled home sales in the past. Suddenly, the community that prided itself on its prestige was under scrutiny. And suddenly, houses weren't selling as fast. Karen had fought to keep things the same. But all she had done was make sure everything changed. One evening, she sat alone in her front yard, staring at the house she had tried so hard to keep vacant. Marcus was outside, laughing with his sister as they carried in groceries. He glanced toward Karen's house. For a second, their eyes met. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He just gave her a single, slow nod, not out of kindness, but acknowledgement. Karen looked away first. She had lost, and deep down, she knew she had deserved to. Prejudice isn't always loud. Sometimes it hides behind concern, behind tradition, behind what's best for the neighborhood. But the truth always comes out. Let this be a reminder. Your actions shape how the world sees you. And sometimes the person who gets exposed isn't the one you expected. If you believe stories like this need to be heard, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep these conversations going.